1515, there is a version of the Cold War that most people carry with them. A version shaped by textbooks and anniversaries, and the general relief that it ended without a nuclear exchange. In that version, the two superpowers squared off across an ideological divide, rattled their weapons occasionally, and then one side collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, while the other declared a kind of victory that nobody quite knew how to celebrate. That version is not false exactly, but it leaves out almost everything that mattered. It leaves out the bunkers dug into mountains and sealed behind blast doors thick enough to survive a direct strike. It leaves out the automated systems that were designed, deliberately and with full institutional approval, to launch weapons without waiting for a human being to give the order. It leaves out the accidents, the false alarms, the moments when men sitting at consoles in underground rooms looked at their displays and saw data suggesting the world was about to end, and had to decide, in the span of a few minutes, whether to believe what they were seeing. It leaves out the facilities that were built, not to prevent war but to survive it, and to continue functioning after most of the population above them had ceased to exist. What follows is not a story about diplomacy or ideology. It is a story about architecture and procedure. It is about the physical infrastructure of a conflict that was always one malfunction away from becoming something that could not be undone. It is about the people who built these places and the people who worked inside them, and the systems that were put in motion and that, in some cases, have never been fully turned off. The Cold War did not end. It consolidated. It went deeper underground, literally and institutionally, and the facilities that were built to fight the final war are still there, some of them still staffed, some of them repurposed, and some of them simply waiting in the dark behind their reinforced doors for a signal that, for now, has not come. The first thing you need to understand about these facilities is that they were not built out of paranoia in the clinical sense. They were built out of planning. There is a difference. Paranoia imagines threats that do not exist. The planners who designed these places were responding to threats that were entirely real and that grew more technically sophisticated with each passing year. When the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device in 1949, 4 years ahead of American projections, the entire strategic calculation shifted overnight. The United States had assumed it would have a decade or more of nuclear monopoly, time to build a deterrent architecture at a measured pace. That assumption dissolved in a single test, and what replaced it was urgency. The urgency produced money, and the money produced construction. And the construction produced a hidden geography of reinforced concrete and buried cable that most citizens of both countries never knew existed, and that their governments took extraordinary measures to keep secret. Raven Rock Mountain Complex, carved into the granite of South Mountain in Pennsylvania, sits approximately 70 miles north of Washington. It was authorized in 1950, which tells you something about the timing. The Korean War had just begun. The Soviets had the bomb, and the people responsible for continuity of government had begun to calculate, seriously and with budgetary precision, what it would mean if Washington ceased to exist as a functioning capital. Raven Rock was the answer to that calculation. It was built to house the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the event of a nuclear strike. The facility extends deep into the rock. It has its own power supply, its own water source, its own communications infrastructure, and its own internal transportation system. Buildings inside the mountain rest on enormous springs designed to absorb the shock of nearby detonations. The people who would operate from inside Raven Rock were not expected to emerge for a very long time. They were expected to govern or to conduct what remained of military operations from within the mountain, while the world outside absorbed whatever had been directed at it. The existence of Raven Rock was not publicly acknowledged for decades. When it was eventually discussed in open sources, the details that emerged were carefully partial. What the facility was designed to do was straightforward enough: preserve the command structure of the American military so that a nuclear exchange could be conducted to its conclusion even if the visible centers of government had been destroyed. This was the logic of the facilities. They were not shelters in the humanitarian sense. They were instruments of continuity designed to ensure that the capacity to destroy could be maintained beyond the initial exchange. The people who would shelter there were not chosen for their moral or intellectual distinction. They were chosen because they held positions that the military and governmental structure needed to function, or believed it needed to function, after a strike. Mount Weather, in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, served a parallel purpose for civilian government. Its existence was one of the more poorly kept secrets of the Cold War, but the details of its interior remained classified for a long time. Congressional representatives learned of its existence primarily through accident, when a plane crashed near its location in 1974, and rescue workers discovered something that did not appear on public maps. The facility housed a shadow government structure, a network of bureaucratic continuity designed to replicate the essential functions of the executive branch. It had a hospital, a crematorium, reservoirs, a radio and television studio, its own emergency broadcast capability, and housing for several thousand people. The people who would occupy it in an emergency had been pre-selected. They had been vetted. Some of them had apparently been told of their designation. Others had not, and would have been notified only when the emergency was underway. What is striking about Mount Weather, and about all of these facilities, is not their scale, but their administrative logic. The people who designed them thought through every institutional detail. They created shadow departments, shadow agencies, shadow chains of command. They created the paperwork structures that a government would need to function. They pre-positioned supplies and records and legal authorities. They thought, with extraordinary procedural care, about what it meant to govern a country most of whose population had just been killed. The answer they arrived at was that you governed it the same way you governed it before, with the same titles and the same procedures and the same institutional hierarchies. And the continuity of those forms was itself a kind of legitimacy, or at least a functional substitute for it. The Greenbrier facility in West Virginia represents a different kind of concealment. Beneath the resort hotel that wealthy Americans had visited for generations, a congressional relocation facility was constructed and maintained in complete secrecy for nearly 3 decades. The facility was built to house the entire United States Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. It had chambers for both the House and the Senate, complete with the furniture and podiums and procedural equipment that would allow legislative business to be conducted. It had dormitories for members and their essential staff. It had a broadcast studio. It had a cafeteria and medical facilities and a decontamination unit. For 30 years, it was maintained and staffed by people whose cover was working for the hotel in various maintenance and communications capacities. The Greenbrier itself, as an institution, was complicit in the deception. Its management knew what was beneath the building. Its guests, including the members of Congress who vacationed there, did not. When the facility was revealed by a journalist in 1992, the government decommissioned it. The logic appeared to be that a facility whose location was known could not serve its intended purpose. But the decommissioning also represented something else. The acknowledgement that the congressional relocation model had never quite made sense. The idea that the legislative branch could be preserved in a resort bunker and continue to function while the country above was being destroyed required a theory of governance that was at least as much symbolic as practical. You cannot legislate for a population that no longer exists in the form it existed before. But the facility was built anyway, maintained anyway, and staffed anyway, because the alternative was to acknowledge that the destruction of the country as it existed was a terminal event rather than a recoverable one, and that acknowledgement was institutionally unacceptable. The Soviet Union built its own version of these facilities, and built them on a scale that reflected both the resources of a command economy and a somewhat different theory of survival. The Yamantau mountain complex in the Ural Mountains is the most discussed and least understood of these Soviet constructions. American intelligence became aware of significant construction activity at the site during the 1990s, which was itself remarkable, because construction of major strategic facilities was continuing even as the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Russian Federation was nominally engaged in cooperative security arrangements with the West. Congressional inquiries were made. Russian officials gave answers that were either incomplete or evasive. The explanations offered over the years included that the facility was a mining operation, a food storage depot, a government retreat, and various other descriptions that did not account for the scale of what imagery analysis suggested was being constructed. What the American intelligence community believed, based on the available evidence, was that Yamantau was a facility of extraordinary size, possibly the largest underground military construction in the world at the time of its active development, designed to serve as a survival complex for the Russian leadership and military command in the event of nuclear war. The tunneling involved was estimated to have produced hundreds of millions of cubic feet of excavated material. The facility appeared to have its own rail connections, its own power infrastructure, and the kind of internal volume that would be required to sustain a large population for an extended period. If those assessments were accurate, Yamantau represented a commitment to the idea that nuclear war was not only survivable at the leadership level, but that survival at the leadership level was worth enormous ongoing investment, even after the Cold War had formally ended. That last point deserves emphasis. The construction and apparent maintenance of Yamantau continued into the post-Soviet period. Whatever the facility was intended to do, the Russian state continued to believe that doing it was worth significant resources and significant diplomatic awkwardness. American officials raised the issue repeatedly through the 1990s and received answers they found unsatisfying. The facility was never publicly explained in terms that would allow independent verification. It remains, as of any public accounting, an unresolved question with very significant implications about what the Russian strategic planning community continues to believe about the possibility of nuclear conflict. The dead hand system, known in Russian as perimeter, represents perhaps the most consequential of all the Cold War's hidden infrastructures because it is a system that was explicitly designed to operate without human decision-making at its final stage. The concept was developed in response to a specific problem that Soviet strategic planners identified in the early 1980s. The problem was decapitation. American counterforce strategy had evolved to the point where a precisely targeted first strike might destroy the Soviet leadership and command structure before retaliatory orders could be issued. If the leaders were dead, the logic went, no retaliation would occur. This created what planners called a stability problem. A sufficiently accurate and sufficiently comprehensive American first strike might succeed in preventing Soviet retaliation, which meant that the deterrent value of Soviet nuclear forces was not absolute. The solution the Soviets developed was to create a system that would issue launch commands automatically in the event that certain conditions were met. The conditions were layered and technical. Seismic sensors would detect nuclear detonations. Radiation sensors would detect characteristic signatures of nuclear explosions. Communication monitoring would determine whether the normal chain of command had gone silent. If these conditions were met in combination, and if no human command had countermanded the system's activation, Perimeter would launch communications rockets that would broadcast launch orders to nuclear missiles across the Soviet Union. The system was designed to work, even if every human being in the chain of command was dead or incapacitated. It was a machine designed to ensure that the threat of retaliation remained credible, even after the government that had issued the threat had ceased to exist. The development of Perimeter was not publicly acknowledged by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was acknowledged by Russian officials in the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union dissolved, apparently partly as a matter of pride and partly as a strategic communication. The system was presented as a rational response to the threat of decapitation, and in purely technical terms, as a solution to a real problem in deterrence theory, it was. But what it also represented was the institutionalization of a decision that no human being would make in the moment. A commitment to retaliation that was embedded in circuitry and protocol rather than in judgment. If Perimeter worked as described, it meant that nuclear war could begin and conclude as a largely automated event, with human beings playing the role of triggering conditions rather than decision makers. There is an important technical nuance here. Perimeter was not a fully automated launch system in the sense that it required no human involvement at all. It required human involvement at the activation stage. Someone in the Soviet command structure had to activate the system, arming it to respond automatically if the conditions for its triggering were met. But once activated, its final decision about whether to launch did not require a human being, and the conditions under which activation would occur were themselves proceduralized. There was a protocol for when perimeter would be turned on. That protocol existed because its designers understood that someone in authority might not be available to make the activation decision when it was needed. The protocol was a way of delegating the activation decision in advance, embedding it in standing orders rather than requiring a live judgment. American planners knew or strongly suspected that the Soviets had developed some version of this capability. The knowledge did not produce a reassuring effect. It produced a different kind of calculation, one in which the technical characteristics of early warning systems and the reliability of sensor networks became existential variables. If a false alarm triggered perimeter's sensing systems, the automated launch sequence might begin. This was not a theoretical concern. Both superpowers had experienced false alarms of various kinds throughout the Cold War, and some of them had come very close to producing catastrophic outcomes through purely human decision-making. Adding an automated layer to that system did not make it more stable. It added a category of failure mode that was qualitatively different from anything that had existed before. The underground command centers that would have been used to operate these systems were themselves remarkable structures. The Soviet Chekhov facility and related command posts were constructed to maintain communication with nuclear forces even after surface infrastructure had been destroyed. They were connected by hardened buried cable, by very low-frequency radio transmitters that could communicate with submarines through hundreds of feet of seawater, and by various redundant systems designed to ensure that a launch order, once issued, would reach its targets. The communications infrastructure of nuclear command was itself a hidden facility, a network of buried transmitters and armored relay stations and submarine-connected systems that extended the reach of command authority below the surface of the Earth and beneath the surface of the ocean. The American Looking Glass aircraft program represented a different approach to the same problem. A Boeing EC-135 aircraft, equipped with communication systems and staffed by a general officer with launch authority, flew continuous airborne patrols for decades, beginning in 1961. The idea was that an aircraft could survive a ground strike that destroyed fixed command facilities, and that an airborne command post could maintain communication with nuclear forces and issue launch orders even if every ground-based facility had been destroyed. For more than 29 years, without interruption, there was always at least one Looking Glass aircraft in the air. The program flew through mechanical failures, crew emergencies, geopolitical crises, and the slow, grinding routine of the peacetime years when nothing happened and everything had to be kept ready as if something would. The crews of these aircraft were trained for a scenario that required them to function as the last surviving link in the chain of nuclear command. If they were in the air and all ground facilities had been destroyed, their general officer would become, in effect, the highest surviving military authority, with the communications capability and the authorizations necessary to direct a nuclear response. The aircraft maintained encrypted communication systems, pre-positioned release codes, and everything else that the scenario required. The crews knew what they were for. They flew their patrols and maintained their equipment and waited every airborne hour for a message they were designed to receive, but that they hoped would never come. The submarine fleet occupied a parallel and in many ways more significant role in this architecture of concealment. Nuclear-armed submarines are, by design, invisible. Their operational value depends entirely on the adversary's inability to know where they are. A submarine that can be located can be destroyed before it launches. A submarine that cannot be located represents a retaliatory threat that survives any conceivable first strike. Both superpowers devoted enormous resources to the dual project of hiding their own submarines and finding the other sides. The Americans built the SOSUS network, a system of hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor that tracked Soviet submarine movements across the North Atlantic and Pacific. The Soviets built their own tracking systems and sent their own intelligence submarines to operate near American facilities and patrol routes. The underwater dimension of the Cold War is one of its least discussed and most consequential aspects. Submarines from both sides operated in close proximity to each other's coastlines, maintaining positioning that would allow them to launch on very short notice if ordered to do so. They operated under communication blackout for extended periods, surfacing to receive messages at scheduled intervals, maintaining a silence that was itself a strategic instrument. The crews of these vessels lived for months in conditions of extreme physical constraint, operating machinery that represented the most destructive technology ever built, under orders that they understood in general terms, but whose full context they could not access from the depths of the ocean. There were collisions. There were equipment failures. There were moments when submarines from the two sides made contact with each other in ways that were not intended and that could have been interpreted in the wrong circumstances as hostile. The records of these incidents were, and in many cases remain, classified. What has emerged in partial declassification over the years suggests a pattern of close encounters and operational near misses that was far more common than the public understanding of the Cold War would suggest. The ocean floor is not empty. It holds, in various locations, the remains of submarines that were lost to accidents and equipment failures and, in at least some cases, to circumstances that have never been fully explained. The Cobra Mist facility at Orford Ness on the English coast represents a different category of hidden infrastructure, an over-the-horizon radar system designed to give early warning of Soviet missile launches by detecting the ionospheric disturbances created by the heat of rocket exhaust. The facility was built in the late 1960s and operated briefly before being decommissioned in 1973, officially because of interference problems that made its radar returns unreliable. The unofficial explanation, which has been discussed in technical and intelligence communities for decades, is that the interference was deliberate, that Soviet jamming technology was specifically tuned to disrupt the Cobra Mist system in ways that made its data useless. If that explanation is accurate, it suggests that Soviet signals intelligence had penetrated the project sufficiently to design a countermeasure before the facility was even fully operational. The question of penetration and counter-penetration runs through the entire history of Cold War facilities. Both sides devoted extraordinary resources to learning what the other had built and where and how it functioned. The American U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union produced intelligence about military construction that was genuinely revelatory, and that also, when the program was exposed by the shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers in 1960, produced a diplomatic crisis that demonstrated exactly how sensitive that intelligence was. The Soviets had known about the overflights for some time before the shoot-down. They had been unable to reach the aircraft with their air defense systems and had made the calculation that shooting down an American aircraft would cost more diplomatically than allowing the intelligence collection to continue. When they finally succeeded in bringing down a U-2, the decision about how to use that event politically was itself a cold, procedural one. The satellite reconnaissance programs that replaced the overflights were more sustainable and more productive, but they operated under their own constraints. Satellite imagery could tell you that a facility was being constructed. It could tell you approximately how large it was. It could tell you what kind of equipment was being moved into it. It could not easily tell you what the facility was designed to do, or how its internal systems worked, or what doctrines governed its operation. The hidden geography of the Cold War was visible in outline from orbit. Its operational details required other kinds of intelligence, and those other kinds required human sources, and human sources required trust and access and time, all of which were difficult to establish in a closed society organized around institutional secrecy. The Kapustin Yar launch facility in southern Russia was one of the Soviet Union's earliest strategic missile test sites. and its existence was known to American intelligence for most of the Cold War, but its full operational scope remained uncertain for decades. Tests conducted at Kapustin Yar included experiments with surface-to-air missiles, ballistic missile systems, and eventually space launch vehicles. The facility was used to test systems that would eventually be deployed at other sites, meaning that what happened at Kapustin Yar had direct implications for what the strategic missile force would eventually look like and how it would perform. Intelligence about test failures was as valuable as intelligence about successes because it told American planners something about the technical limitations that Soviet weapons might have in operational conditions. The Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan is better known as a space launch facility, and it genuinely was. It was the site from which Sputnik was launched, from which Yuri Gagarin departed, from which the Soviet space program conducted most of its major operations. But it was built on top of, and alongside, an extensive ballistic missile testing and deployment infrastructure. The division between the civilian and military programs at Baikonur was always more administrative than physical. The rockets that launched satellites and the rockets that carried warheads were developed in parallel, often by the same design bureaus, using the same fundamental technologies. The Cosmodrome was a military facility that also launched spacecraft, or a spacecraft facility built on a military infrastructure, depending on how you chose to look at it. The concealment involved was not so much a matter of hiding the facility, which was known, as of obscuring the relationship between its civilian and military functions. The American SAGE system, the semi-automatic ground environment, represents one of the most ambitious and most architecturally distinctive of the Cold War's hidden facilities. SAGE was a continent-spanning network of massive computer centers designed to coordinate air defense against Soviet bomber attacks. Each SAGE facility was housed in a building of unusual size, a 4-story reinforced concrete structure containing the largest computers of their era, connected by telephone lines and radar networks to tracking stations across North America. The buildings themselves were significant structures. They were designed to continue functioning after nearby nuclear detonations, with blast hardening and redundant power systems and enough internal resources to maintain operations for extended periods. The computers inside SAGE buildings were genuine technical achievements, among the first real-time interactive computing systems ever built. Operators sat at consoles with early display screens and light guns, tracking targets on radar feeds and coordinating intercept vectors. The system was designed to be faster than human judgment acting alone, to take the flood of sensor data coming in from across the continent and organize it into a picture that human operators could act on in time to matter. It represented an early and important step in the long project of designing systems that could make decisions or support decisions faster than unaided human cognition allowed. SAGE was also, in retrospect, a system built for a threat that was already being superseded by the time it was completed. The bomber threat was real when SAGE was designed. By the time the system reached full operational capability, the Soviets had developed and deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, which traveled much faster than bombers, on trajectories that SAGE's radar networks were not optimized to track, with flight times that made coordinated interception a different and much harder problem. The enormous investment in SAGE produced a sophisticated system for addressing a threat that was becoming secondary. This is not a criticism of the people who built it. They were responding to the threat as it existed when they began, and the threat changed faster than any system of that scale could adapt. The missile silos that replaced the bomber as the primary delivery vehicle for nuclear weapons created their own category of hidden facility. Silo construction across the American Midwest and Plain States in the early 1960s was not exactly secret in the sense that local communities were unaware of it. The construction activity was too large and too obvious to conceal at the local level. What was concealed was the precise operational parameters of the silos, the specific missiles they held, the targeting assignments they carried, and the command arrangements that governed their launch. The silos were hardened to survive nuclear near misses. The missiles inside them were maintained in a constant state of readiness. The crews who monitored them worked in underground capsules connected to the silos by hardened cable, in rotating shifts, in conditions of sustained isolation that the Air Force managed with its own administrative apparatus of psychological screening and performance monitoring. The psychological dimension of this work deserves more attention than it usually receives. The men and women who operated these systems, who sat in underground capsules with launch keys within reach, who maintained the readiness of weapons whose sole purpose was mass destruction, who did this work year after year, in conditions of institutional routine, were asked to hold a particular psychological position that had no real precedent in human history. They were trained to be reliable and disciplined and psychologically stable under conditions that would, in any other context, be recognized as deeply abnormal. The institutional solution to this was procedure. Everything was proceduralized. The routines were designed to fill the hours and to maintain readiness and to prevent the kind of reflection that might interfere with the reliability the system required. There were failures of this system. There were Minuteman missile crew members who were found to be using drugs to manage the tedium and psychological pressure of their assignments. There were instances of disciplinary problems and performance failures that the Air Force dealt with quietly and internally. There were reports, some of them credible, of crew members who had developed serious reservations about their roles and had sought guidance from within a system that had no framework for processing such reservations. The system could acknowledge mechanical failures and address them. It was less well equipped to acknowledge human failures because to acknowledge them too openly was to raise questions about reliability that the entire strategic deterrent theory depended on answering in the affirmative. The B-61 nuclear gravity bomb represented a different kind of distributed facility, a weapon that existed at dozens of locations across Europe, and that was part of a NATO nuclear sharing arrangement whose details were classified, but whose broad outlines were known to anyone who followed the relevant policy debates. The bombs were stored at air bases in several European countries under American control, but notionally available to be delivered by aircraft of the host nations under certain circumstances. The storage facilities at these bases were hardened, earth-covered bunkers called weapons storage and security systems vaults, embedded in the tarmac of the air bases, accessible only through carefully controlled procedures involving multiple personnel and multiple authentication steps. The geographic distribution of these weapons across European bases was itself a statement about the nature of the NATO alliance and the theory of deterrence it embodied. Having American nuclear weapons on the soil of European allies served both a practical and a political function. Practically, it reduced the flight time to Soviet targets. Politically, it embedded American nuclear commitment in a physical way that diplomatic assurances alone could not replicate. It also created security challenges that required ongoing management. The weapons had to be maintained and protected at multiple locations, each with its own security environment, and each dependent on the reliable functioning of its host nation's military and political institutions. The system worked, in the sense that no unauthorized access occurred and no weapons were diverted. But it was a system with complexity, and complexity creates vulnerability. The Able Archer 83 exercise brought these systems to a point of genuine danger that was not fully understood by American planners at the time it was occurring. Able Archer was a NATO command post exercise designed to practice the procedures for nuclear release. It was more realistic than previous exercises in certain respects. It used different radio procedures, it involved actual movement of forces, and it simulated a full progression from conventional conflict to nuclear release in ways that previous exercises had not. Soviet intelligence, watching the exercise from the outside, appears to have concluded, at least within some analytical units of the KGB and GRU, that the exercise might be cover for an actual first strike preparation. The Soviet response was not merely analytical. Soviet nuclear forces in Europe were apparently placed on an elevated alert status during Able Archer. Aircraft in Eastern Europe were loaded with nuclear weapons and placed in a ready status. The intelligence picture assembled by Soviet analysts suggested, within the logic of their threat model, that the United States might be genuinely preparing to strike. The exercise was real. The preparations, it looked like, were real preparations for nuclear war. The gap between the two required someone, somewhere in the Soviet system, to make an assessment that turned out to be correct. That assessment could have gone the other way. The fact that it did not is a fact about judgment, but judgment operating under conditions of extreme uncertainty and institutional pressure. Judgment that could have broken in a different direction without any one person doing anything obviously wrong. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB officer who was also a British intelligence asset, provided information after the fact that helped Western analysts understand how seriously Soviet intelligence had taken the Able Archer period. His account suggested that the Soviet leadership was genuinely alarmed, that the alerts were not merely precautionary posturing, but reflected real concern about imminent attack. When American officials absorbed this information, it appears to have had a genuine effect on how subsequent exercises were conducted. But the learning happened after the danger had passed, which is the characteristic pattern of near-miss learning. You understand the risk most clearly from the far side of it. The Soviet early warning satellite system experienced a failure in September 1983 that created a situation whose outcome depended on the judgment of a single individual. Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at the Serpukhov 15 bunker outside Moscow, the facility responsible for monitoring Soviet early warning satellites. The system reported the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The report was not a single ambiguous signal. It was a definitive alarm, indicating first one launch, then 4 more. The system was confident. Its indicators were clear. If the system was correct, Petrov was looking at the beginning of an American first strike. The protocol he operated under required him to report the warning up the chain of command. Reporting an unambiguous launch warning would initiate a response process that, given the doctrine and the systems in place, would likely lead to a retaliatory launch within the available warning time. Petrov did not report it as an attack. He reported it as a system malfunction. His reasoning, reconstructed afterward, was that an American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5, and that the satellite system had a known history of false alarms related to specific atmospheric conditions that could cause sunlight reflected off clouds to be misidentified as missile exhaust. He was right. The system had generated a false alarm. His judgment, operating against the institutional pressure to follow protocol, prevented the false alarm from initiating a process that might have ended in a real exchange. What Petrov's decision represents, in the context of these hidden facilities and the systems they housed, is the precise opposite of what Perimeter was designed to achieve. Perimeter was designed to remove human judgment from the final stage of the launch sequence, on the grounds that human judgment might be unavailable or unreliable at the critical moment. Petrov's case suggests that human judgment, operating outside protocol, was the thing that prevented catastrophe. The two lessons are in direct tension. The institutional response to both cases is instructive. Perimeter was developed further and maintained. Petrov was not disciplined for violating protocol, but was also not celebrated, and eventually received quiet official recognition only long after the Cold War had ended. The facility at Serpukhov 15 where Petrov worked was not publicized. The incident was not publicized. It was known within the Soviet military and intelligence community and was presumably analyzed within the system that had produced the false alarm, but it was not part of any public accounting of Cold War risks. That it became known at all is largely the result of post-Soviet disclosure, and the full record of what the system showed that night and what exactly happened in the minutes after the alarm is still not completely public. This is representative of how these incidents are embedded in the historical record. Partially visible, always incomplete, never fully resolved into a clear picture of how close things actually came. The Thule Air Base in Greenland housed a critical node of the American Early Warning Network and was also the site of an accident that could have had consequences far beyond what it actually produced. In January 1968, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed and burned on the sea ice near the base. The high explosives in the weapons detonated, which scattered radioactive material across the ice and the water beneath it. The bombs themselves did not detonate in a nuclear sense, because the specific safety mechanisms that prevent inadvertent nuclear detonation functioned as designed. But the accident released plutonium and other radioactive materials in ways that required an extensive and largely classified cleanup operation involving hundreds of American and Danish personnel. The complication with Thule involved the specific question of whether all 4 weapons were actually recovered. The official American position has been that all 4 were accounted for. Danish and other researchers examining the available records have raised questions about whether one weapon or a significant portion of one weapon may have sunk to the seafloor and was not recovered. The question was not resolved publicly, and the relevant American records remained classified for decades. The Thule accident was eventually acknowledged, but the full account of what was recovered and what was not has been contested ever since, in a way that suggests either genuine uncertainty within the government about exactly what happened to all the material, or a deliberate decision to maintain an official account that is more reassuring than the actual record supports. This kind of partial disclosure and contested record is characteristic of the nuclear accident history more broadly. The Broken Arrow incidents, as the American military designates accidents involving nuclear weapons, number in the dozens over the course of the Cold War. Some of them involved aircraft crashes, some involved drops, some involved fires or floods at storage facilities, some involved the loss of weapons that were being transported by sea. The full list has never been publicly released in its complete form. What has been released through Freedom of Information requests and congressional inquiries over the years is partial. It is clear that the partial record contains incidents that are more serious than anything that appears in the official public accounting, and it is also clear that the government's interest in maintaining public confidence in the safety of nuclear weapons has been a factor in how much information has been released and when. The Palomares incident in Spain in January 1966 is one of the more extensively documented of these accidents, partly because it occurred over a populated area and could not be concealed in the same way that accidents over ocean or in remote areas could. A B-52 collided with its refueling tanker over the Spanish coast, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell into the farmland and coastal waters of the Almeria region. 2 bombs landed on land and ruptured, releasing plutonium that contaminated the surrounding farmland. 2 bombs fell into the Mediterranean. One was recovered relatively quickly from shallow water. The other took nearly 3 months to locate and recover, using advanced search techniques and submersible vehicles that were operating at or beyond the limits of available technology. During those 3 months, the American government maintained that the weapon would be found and that there was no cause for alarm, while the actual search effort was consuming enormous resources and producing considerable anxiety within the program. The Spanish government's cooperation was secured partly through diplomatic assurances and partly through the practical necessity that the American military needed access to Spanish territory and waters to conduct the search. The cleanup of the contaminated farmland involved removing thousands of tons of soil and shipping it to the United States for disposal. Some of the farmland was never fully remediated. The plutonium dispersed by the ruptured weapons has a half-life of 24,000 years. The land in the Almeria region still carries contamination from 1966. The Soviet submarine KE-129, lost in the Pacific in March 1968, represents a different category of hidden history. The submarine sank, in circumstances that have never been fully explained, in deep water northwest of Hawaii. The Soviet Navy conducted an extensive search and failed to find it. American signals intelligence assets, including the SOSUS hydrophone network, had tracked the submarine and recorded the acoustic signature of its loss. The American government knew where the submarine was and chose not to tell the Soviets. Instead, it undertook one of the most extraordinary covert engineering projects of the Cold War, a multi-year effort to design and build a specialized ship that could lift the submarine from the ocean floor and recover its contents, including the nuclear warheads it carried and any cryptographic or intelligence materials that might have survived. The project, known as Project Azorian, was conducted under the cover of a commercial deep-sea mining venture. The ship built for it, the Glomar Explorer, was nominally owned by Howard Hughes and presented publicly as a research vessel for manganese nodule mining. The cover was elaborate and was maintained even as the ship conducted its actual mission in 1974. The mission succeeded in recovering a portion of the submarine, the forward section, which contained human remains, torpedoes, and some materials of intelligence value. The aft section, which contained the submarine's missile compartment and potentially more significant intelligence materials, broke away during recovery and sank back to the bottom. The human remains recovered from K-129 were, according to American accounts, given a burial at sea with appropriate ceremony. Whether this ceremony was genuine or ceremonial in the bureaucratic sense is something that cannot be verified from outside. The families of the K-129 crew were never informed by the Soviet government of the circumstances of the submarine's loss and were not informed by the American government of what had been found. The Soviet government's official position was that the submarine's loss was unexplained. The American government's knowledge of what happened was classified. The gap between the two official positions was occupied by the men who died on the submarine and whose fate was known to one government and concealed by both. The Glomar response, the phrase that emerged from Freedom of Information litigation over the Project Azorian records, has become a term of legal art in government transparency cases. When journalists sought records about the project, the CIA responded that it could neither confirm nor deny the existence of the documents being requested. This response form, the Glomar response, has been used in hundreds of subsequent cases involving sensitive intelligence matters. The phrase originated in an effort to maintain the cover of a project that had already been disclosed by journalist Jack Anderson. The cover was broken before the legal response was formulated, but the response form outlasted the specific situation that generated it and has been used ever since as a tool for maintaining official silence about matters the government prefers not to acknowledge. The British equivalent of these survival and command facilities was organized around a somewhat different institutional framework, reflecting the United Kingdom's different scale and different strategic position. The Corsham underground city in Wiltshire, part of a network of tunnels and chambers originally built as a wartime storage facility in converted Bath stone quarries, was developed during the Cold War into a facility intended to house the central government war headquarters. The facility, known by various designations over the years, eventually encompassed hundreds of thousands of square feet of underground space, with accommodation for several thousand government officials, its own power generation, water supply, communication facilities, and the administrative infrastructure for continuity of government. The Corsham facility's existence was not entirely secret in the sense that its general location was known and its history as a wartime installation was documented. What was classified was its Cold War purpose and its current state of readiness. It was maintained and staffed for decades with periodic upgrades to its communication systems and its life support equipment. At some point in the 1990s, following the end of the Cold War, it was decommissioned as an active government facility. The tunnels and chambers still exist. Some portions have been converted to commercial use, which has the somewhat disorienting quality of all these transformations. Spaces built to be the last refuge of government in the event of nuclear war, now being used to store commercial data or to host tours. The NORAD facility inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado is probably the best known of all the Cold War underground installations, partly because its existence was publicly acknowledged relatively early, and partly because it became a cultural reference point for the era's anxieties. The facility was constructed during the early 1960s, driven by the same logic that drove all the others: the need to preserve command capability against a nuclear strike. The mountain itself was chosen because its granite composition provided natural shielding against blast and radiation. The construction involved excavating 3 large caverns connected by tunnels, within which a complex of freestanding buildings was constructed. The buildings rest on enormous springs, 1,500 of them, each capable of compressing under blast loading. The facility has its own power plants, its own fuel storage, its own water supply from a mountain spring, and enough provisions to allow extended operations. The specific mission of Cheyenne Mountain evolved over the life of the facility. Its primary role was aerospace warning and defense, tracking objects in space and in the atmosphere that might represent threats to North American territory. The radar networks and satellite sensor systems that fed data into the facility gave it a comprehensive picture of what was in the sky above the continent. Processing that picture, correlating it, distinguishing actual threats from the enormous background noise of legitimate aerospace activity, required computing capability that was state-of-the-art for its era, and that required constant upgrading as the threat environment changed. The transition from bombers to ballistic missiles as the primary nuclear threat created a particular challenge for Cheyenne Mountain. A bomber could be tracked for hours, intercepted, potentially turned back. A ballistic missile's flight time from Soviet launch to American target was measured in tens of minutes. The warning time available was sufficient to initiate a response, but not sufficient for deliberate, reflective decision-making. The systems inside Cheyenne Mountain were designed to compress the decision cycle as much as possible, to get a warning to decision-makers in the shortest possible time, so that whatever time remained could be used for the response decision. But the compression of decision time also compressed the opportunity for the kind of careful assessment that distinguishes a genuine attack from a false alarm. The false alarm history at Cheyenne Mountain and related facilities is a record that has been made partially public through congressional testimony and investigative reporting, and it is more extensive than public awareness of it would suggest. In November 1979, a training tape simulating a massive Soviet nuclear attack was accidentally inserted into the live system, causing warning messages to go out to nuclear forces indicating that an attack was underway. Bomber crews began to prepare for launch. Missile launch crews were alerted. The error was identified within a few minutes before any irreversible actions were taken, but the episode demonstrated that the boundary between simulation and reality within these systems was technically very thin. The fix applied afterward, requiring physical separation of training tapes from live systems, was a mechanical solution to a problem that was essentially architectural. The system had been designed in a way that allowed the confusion to occur in the first place. Less than a year later, in June 1980, a faulty computer chip caused the Cheyenne Mountain warning systems to indicate, repeatedly, that Soviet submarine-launched missiles were in flight toward American territory. The chip cost 46 cents. Its failure produced alerts that set nuclear bomber crews at bases across the country moving toward their aircraft. The indicators on the displays inside Cheyenne Mountain fluctuated between showing 0 missiles inbound and showing 220 missiles inbound, because the chip failure was producing intermittent false data rather than a consistent false reading. The inconsistency was part of what allowed operators to identify the alert as a malfunction rather than a real event. A more consistent false alarm, one that produced steadily escalating numbers rather than oscillating ones, might have been harder to dismiss. The human factors in these false alarm events are as significant as the technical ones. The people monitoring these systems operated within institutional frameworks that created pressure in both directions. Pressure to take warnings seriously, because failing to respond to a real attack would be catastrophic, and pressure to avoid false escalation, because initiating a response to a false alarm would also be catastrophic. These pressures existed simultaneously and pointed in opposite directions, and the resolution of the tension between them depended on individual judgment operating under time pressure and incomplete information. The protocols were designed to help, but protocols are written in advance for anticipated situations, and the specific characteristics of each false alarm were always somewhat different from what the protocols assumed. The Norwegian rocket incident of 1995 illustrates that these pressures did not end with the Cold War. In January 1995, a Norwegian scientific rocket launched from a research facility was detected by Russian radar systems and briefly assessed as a possible submarine-launched ballistic missile on a trajectory that could be headed for Russian territory. The assessment reached the highest levels of the Russian command structure, and the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget system that allows the Russian president to authorize nuclear launch, was activated and presented to President Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin, his defense minister and his chief of the general staff had several minutes in which the decision needed to be made. The rocket's trajectory eventually made clear that it was not heading for Russian territory, and the alert was stood down. This incident occurred after the formal end of the Cold War, after the signing of START treaties, after the establishment of various cooperative security arrangements between Russia and the United States. It occurred because the technical systems that had been built during the Cold War were still operating, still watching the same threat vectors, still processing sensor data according to the same analytical frameworks. The Norwegian rocket looked, in its initial trajectory, like something the systems had been designed to detect. The fact that it was not what it appeared to be required someone to wait long enough to see where it was going. The margin was sufficient. The margin, in other cases, might not have been. The Svalbard archipelago in the Norwegian Arctic, technically Norwegian territory but subject to the Svalbard Treaty that allows all signatory nations to conduct certain activities there, became a site of Cold War intelligence activity that operated in the ambiguous space between legitimate presence and espionage. Soviet mining operations at Barentsburg, technically commercial, maintained a significant Soviet presence on Norwegian sovereign territory. That presence was associated with monitoring and communication activities that served purposes beyond coal mining. The geographic position of Svalbard, at the apex of the Arctic, gave it exceptional value for tracking submarine movements and long-range communications. The Norwegian government's management of this situation, maintaining sovereignty while accommodating treaty obligations and Soviet presence, was itself a form of hidden negotiation, conducted partly in diplomatic channels and partly in the various informal understandings that govern relationships between countries that are officially at peace and unofficially monitoring each other constantly. The Pine Gap facility in Australia, operated jointly by the Australian and American governments, represents a category of hidden facility whose concealment operated differently in an Allied context. The facility's existence was publicly known, but its specific functions were classified at a level that the Australian government, as a formal partner, was not always fully briefed on. This created a peculiar situation in which the host government had formally agreed to the facility's operation, had signed agreements governing it, had committed to its defense and security, but did not necessarily know in detail what it was doing on its own territory. The functions Pine Gap served evolved over time, from satellite control and signals intelligence collection to a broader role in global surveillance and eventually in supporting operations that extended well beyond the Cold War context in which it was established. The political dynamics of Pine Gap within Australia illustrate something that was true of many Allied facilities: the gap between official acceptance and public understanding, and the pressure that gap created when it became visible. Australian Labor governments periodically expressed discomfort with the lack of full briefing on Pine Gap's activities. The 1975 dismissal of the Whitlam government has been connected by some researchers, though the connection remains disputed and partially speculative, to concerns within American intelligence about the Whitlam government's approach to the facility and to the broader intelligence relationship. Whether or not that specific connection holds, the structural tension between host nation political accountability and the operational security requirements of intelligence facilities was real, and it created friction at various points in the relationship between Australia and its American partner. The RAF Menwith Hill facility in England operated a similar kind of concealed depth. Officially, a communications relay station, actually one of the largest signals intelligence facilities in the world, with the most extensive collection of satellite interception equipment of any facility on British soil. Its growth over the Cold War decades was visible to anyone who looked at the landscape. because the radomes that house its antennas are large white spheres that dot the Yorkshire moors in numbers that grew steadily year after year. The visible fact of large-scale expansion could not be concealed, but the specific capabilities and the intelligence collected could be, and was. The British government's relationship with the facility was structured to allow the collection of intelligence that British law might have prohibited if collected by British agencies, using the partnership with the NSA and its American legal authorities as a mechanism for accessing information that could then be shared back under intelligence sharing arrangements. This structural use of Allied facilities to circumvent domestic legal restrictions on surveillance was not unique to the British case. The signals intelligence relationships among the so-called Five Eyes nations, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were organized in ways that created complementary capabilities and also created legal and political ambiguities that allowed each government to access information that its own legal framework would have made difficult or impossible to collect directly. The facilities that housed this collection were distributed across Allied territory in ways that reflected both technical requirements and the political landscape of what was domestically sustainable in each country. The Echelon system, the satellite interception network that used these facilities and others, was one of the more significant hidden infrastructures of the late Cold War and post-Cold War period. Its existence was discussed in intelligence and technical communities for years before it received substantial public attention. When it did receive attention in European parliamentary investigations in the late 1990s, the official American and British response was to neither confirm nor deny specific capabilities while acknowledging in general terms that signals intelligence was collected by Allied nations from various facilities. The European Parliament investigation concluded that Echelon existed, that it had the capabilities attributed to it, and that it was being used in ways that included commercial intelligence collection for the benefit of American companies competing with European ones. None of these conclusions produced definitive official acknowledgement or significant changes in how the system operated. The concept of the dead hand and the concept of Echelon represent the two poles of what the hidden infrastructure of the Cold War was designed to achieve. Dead hand was designed to ensure that the decision to destroy had an automated guarantee of execution. Echelon was designed to ensure that all information, flowed toward the centers of power that could use it. Together, they represent the infrastructure of a conflict whose defining characteristic was the management of information and the management of escalation, both of which required systems that could operate with minimal human intervention at critical moments, because human intervention at critical moments was too slow, too unpredictable, and too subject to the kinds of failure that the Cold War's planners had decided they could not afford. The Duga radar system, known to Western intelligence as Steel Yard and to amateur radio operators across the world as the Russian woodpecker because of the distinctive pecking sound it created on shortwave frequencies, was one of the most ambitious and most disruptive of all the Cold War's hidden facilities. It was an over-the-horizon radar system designed to detect intercontinental ballistic missile launches from American territory by bouncing radar signals off the ionosphere and detecting the reflection from missile exhaust. The system required enormous antennas. The primary transmitter array near Chernobyl was hundreds of meters long and tens of meters high, a vast steel structure in a forest that was visible for miles. The Duga system's interference with shortwave radio frequencies made it known to the entire global radio amateur community, who had no idea what was causing the interference or where it was coming from. The mystery of the Russian woodpecker was a genuine puzzle for years, discussed in radio magazines and among hobbyists who were experiencing its effects without being able to identify its source. The system's location near what would become the Chernobyl nuclear power plant added a layer of irony that became apparent only after the 1986 disaster. One of the Soviet Union's most ambitious strategic facilities sat adjacent to what became the Soviet Union's most consequential industrial catastrophe. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, now encompasses both the ruined reactor and the ruins of the Duga antenna array, decaying together in the same contaminated forest. The Chernobyl disaster itself, while not primarily a Cold War military story, had Cold War dimensions that were consequential. The disaster occurred during a period of unusual openness in Soviet political culture, early in the Gorbachev era when glasnost was beginning to create space for public acknowledgement of failures that previous administrations would have suppressed entirely. The decision about how to handle the Chernobyl disaster, how much to acknowledge, how quickly, to whom, was made under pressure from both the institutional instinct to conceal and the new political environment that made concealment more costly. The initial response was to contain information, which produced the delays in evacuation that increased radiation exposure for people in the affected area. The subsequent response, under sustained pressure from the political environment and from the obvious scale of the disaster, was to acknowledge far more than Soviet institutional culture would previously have allowed. The Chernobyl disaster had direct implications for the Cold War military picture because several of the Soviet military facilities in the affected area, including the Duga radar installation, had to be abandoned. The evacuation of the Chernobyl exclusion zone included military and intelligence personnel whose work was abruptly terminated. The extent to which the disaster affected Soviet military and intelligence capabilities in the region was not publicly assessed at the time, and remains partially unclear. What is clear is that a major strategic facility was abandoned not because of enemy action, but because of a malfunction in the civilian nuclear infrastructure that shared the same geographic space. The relationship between civilian and military nuclear infrastructure throughout the Cold War was itself a hidden dimension of the conflict. Both superpowers built civilian nuclear power programs that were organizationally separate from their weapons programs but that shared technical expertise, material flows, and institutional cultures. The same agencies that managed the weapons programs often had oversight responsibility for civilian reactors. The same technical communities produced expertise that flowed in both directions. The line between civilian and military nuclear activity was real but permeable, and the management of that permeability was itself a significant challenge for the organizations involved. The Soviet nuclear weapons complex was organized through a closed city system, a network of cities that did not appear on maps, whose populations were isolated from the general Soviet public, and in which the most sensitive aspects of nuclear weapons design and production were conducted. These cities, known by postal codes rather than names, housed the design bureaus, the production facilities, the test infrastructure, and the administrative systems that supported the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The people who lived in them had access to consumer goods and services that were not available to the general Soviet population, as a form of compensation for the isolation and secrecy of their lives. They were not free to leave and return without permission. Their correspondence was monitored. Their social networks were largely confined to others in the same system. The closed city system created a kind of institutional bubble within the Soviet military-industrial complex, a space where the normal informational environment of Soviet society, already heavily managed, was additionally controlled. The scientists and engineers who designed Soviet nuclear weapons lived in a world where the parameters of their professional situation were unusual in every direction. The work was technically demanding and strategically significant. The isolation was real and enforced. The material conditions were relatively comfortable by Soviet standards, and the awareness that the products of their work were capable of destroying civilization was presumably present, though how it was managed at an individual, psychological level is something that can only be partially reconstructed from the accounts of people who eventually left those environments and spoke about their experiences. The American equivalent, the network of national laboratories and production facilities that constituted the American nuclear weapons complex, was less geographically isolated but similarly institutionally contained. Los Alamos, Sandia, Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge, the Savannah River site, and the other facilities in the complex were not closed cities in the Soviet sense. Their locations were known. Their general functions were known. but the specific work conducted within them was classified at levels that created effective isolation from the broader scientific and technical community. Researchers who worked on weapons programs could not publish their results. They could not discuss their work at professional conferences. They were embedded in a community of cleared colleagues and isolated from the broader scientific world in ways that had real effects on the intellectual culture of the institutions involved. The Hanford site in Washington state, which produced the plutonium for the Trinity test and for the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, continued to operate as a production facility throughout the Cold War, generating the plutonium that the expanding American arsenal required. The production process left behind enormous quantities of radioactive and chemical waste that were stored in underground tanks on the site. The tanks were not designed for permanent storage. They were designed for temporary storage while a more permanent solution was developed. The permanent solution was never developed in the time frame the temporary tanks were designed for. By the time serious attention was directed at the problem, some of the tanks had been leaking for years, contaminating the soil and groundwater beneath the site in ways that will require remediation over a period measured in decades at a cost that runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The Hanford contamination is an example of how the hidden facilities of the Cold War created consequences that were not anticipated, or were anticipated and deferred, because the immediate strategic requirements of the weapons program took precedence over any other consideration. The people who made the decisions about Hanford's waste storage were operating within an institutional context that valued production above all else, because production served the deterrent mission that the entire complex existed to support. The long-term environmental consequences were a problem for a future that was always being deferred in favor of the immediate present of the strategic competition. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado presents a similar pattern. The facility produced chemical weapons and nerve agents during and after World War II, and also produced pesticides under a commercial leasing arrangement with Shell Chemical. The chemical contamination of the site is one of the most extensive in the United States. The cleanup program, when it was eventually initiated, was a Superfund project of unusual scale. The site has now been converted to a national wildlife refuge, which is one of the stranger transformations in the history of American land use. A former chemical weapons production site, heavily contaminated with nerve agents and industrial chemicals, now serving as habitat for birds and other wildlife, on the grounds that the contamination, while real and persistent, is apparently compatible with certain kinds of ecological function, even as it remains incompatible with human habitation. The submarine base at Holy Loch in Scotland, which housed American Polaris and later Poseidon submarines for 3 decades, was a different kind of hidden facility in plain sight. Its presence was publicly known and locally controversial. The base was established in 1961 and maintained until 1992, providing a forward operating base for American strategic submarines in the eastern North Atlantic. The submarines based there could reach Soviet targets far more quickly than submarines operating from American ports, and their presence in European waters was part of the NATO nuclear posture in ways that were documented in official agreements and discussed in public debates. But the specific operational assignments of the submarines, the targets they were assigned, the alert states they maintained, the precise capabilities they represented, were classified in ways that left significant aspects of their strategic function concealed. The presence of the base was a significant local political issue in Scotland throughout its existence, and the Scottish National Party's opposition to nuclear weapons was partly shaped by the concrete reality of American nuclear submarines operating from Scottish waters. This created a dynamic in which the base was simultaneously a public fact and an institutional secret, its existence acknowledged and its function described only in general terms, with the specific operational details that would allow any real assessment of its strategic significance held within classification structures that neither the British public nor, in many cases, British politicians could access. The Clyde submarine base at Faslane, which became the home of the British nuclear deterrent when the UK's Polaris submarines entered service in the late 1960s, has a different political trajectory. American submarines left Holy Loch when the Cold War ended, but British submarines remain at Faslane, carrying Trident missiles on continuous at-sea deterrence patrols that have not been interrupted since the first British submarine began such patrols in the late 1960s. The practice of continuous at-sea deterrence, maintaining a submarine on patrol at all times so that the deterrent can never be fully disarmed by a preemptive strike, has continued for more than half a century without interruption. The specific terms under which it would end, the conditions that would have to be met for Britain to decide that continuous patrolling was no longer necessary, have never been publicly articulated in a way that would allow any real assessment of when it might happen. The French nuclear force, the force de frappe, was developed as an independent deterrent that gave France the ability to strike the Soviet Union without relying on the American nuclear guarantee. The decision to develop an independent nuclear capability reflected Charles de Gaulle's assessment that the American commitment to use nuclear weapons in defense of France could not be relied upon absolutely, and that France therefore needed its own capability. The facilities built to support the French deterrent, the test sites in the Sahara and later in the Pacific, the production infrastructure, the submarine and aircraft basing arrangements, represented a significant investment that France made in the logic of independent deterrence. The French nuclear tests in Algeria in the 1960s, and later at the Mururoa and Fangataufa atolls in French Polynesia, were conducted in ways that produced radioactive contamination of significant geographic areas. The Saharan tests left contamination that persisted for decades. The Pacific tests, conducted over 3 decades, produced contamination of the atoll structures that French government studies have acknowledged, but that independent researchers have argued are more serious than official assessments have indicated. The legacy of these tests is a continued political issue in French Polynesia, where communities living on atolls near the test sites have documented health effects that they attribute to radiation exposure and that French government compensation programs have only partially addressed. The hidden facilities that sustained these test programs, the support infrastructure at isolated Pacific atolls, the communications networks, the scientific measurement installations, represent a category of facility that was not secret in the same way that underground command posts were secret. Their general location was known. Their function was officially described. What was not public was the full extent of the contamination they produced, the health effects experienced by workers and local populations, and the internal scientific assessments that informed French government decisions about how long to continue testing and how to characterize the risks. Those assessments remain partially classified, and the full picture of what the French nuclear test program did to the Pacific environment and the people who lived near it continues to be contested. The Chinese nuclear test program at Lop Nur in the Xinjiang region of northwest China conducted its tests in an area that was remote from Han Chinese population centers, but was within range of Uyghur communities that had lived in the region for generations. The health consequences for those communities have been studied by researchers in Japan, Sweden, and other countries who have had access to data that Chinese government sources have not made available. The studies that have been published suggest significant health effects consistent with radiation exposure, including elevated rates of certain cancers and birth defects in communities within the fallout patterns of the tests. The Chinese government has not acknowledged these findings and has not established compensation programs for affected communities. The pattern that emerges across all of these test programs, American, Soviet, British, French, and Chinese, is one in which the strategic requirements of nuclear weapons development consistently overrode the health and safety interests of populations in proximity to test sites. Those populations were, in most cases, politically marginal. Indigenous people in the American Southwest and Pacific Islands, Kazakh communities near Soviet test sites, Uyghur communities in northwestern China. The marginality was not coincidental. Test sites were chosen for their geographic remoteness, which correlated reliably with the political marginality of local populations. The people who lived near these facilities had less political power to resist or to demand accountability. and they bore a disproportionate share of the costs of the nuclear programs from which they derived no strategic benefit. The Indian Springs Air Force Base in Nevada, now Creech Air Force Base, became during the 1990s and 2000s the operational center for the drone warfare program, which represents in certain respects the continuation of Cold War facility logic into the contemporary period. The surveillance and strike capabilities that Cold War satellite and signals intelligence programs developed were adapted and extended into unmanned systems that could operate continuously, at lower cost, in environments where the loss of a manned aircraft would carry diplomatic and political costs. The facilities that operate these systems, the ground control stations and satellite link nodes and data processing centers, are themselves a kind of hidden infrastructure, geographically distributed, operationally opaque, and connected to effects in distant places through chains of decision-making and technical execution that are not publicly described in operational detail. The Menwith Hill facility in Yorkshire, mentioned earlier in the context of Cold War signals intelligence, became a significant node in the infrastructure supporting targeted killing operations in the post-Cold War period. Its satellite collection capabilities were adapted to support locating targets in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere. The British government's understanding of how its territory was being used for these purposes, and the legal framework within which it had consented to that use, were subjects of parliamentary questions and judicial proceedings. The facility built during the Cold War to collect signals intelligence in a strategic confrontation was repurposed for tactical operations in a different kind of conflict, using the same institutional relationships and much of the same physical infrastructure on the grounds that the partnership that had built and sustained the facility during the Cold War created ongoing obligations and ongoing authorities. The F-117 Nighthawk program, the first operational stealth aircraft, was developed at facilities in the Nevada desert, so classified that the aircraft's existence was denied for years after it entered service. The Lockheed Skunk Works facility that designed it, and the Tonopah test range where it was initially based and operated, maintained a secrecy environment that required extraordinary measures. Pilots were required to live on base during their operational assignments. Aircraft movements were conducted exclusively at night. Maintenance crews worked under light discipline that prevented any visibility of operations from outside the base perimeter. This was possible partly because the facility was in a remote area of Nevada with limited civilian access, and partly because the institutional culture of extreme secrecy that had been built in the Cold War was applied to the program with full Cold War rigor. The F-117's eventual public acknowledgement in 1988, when the Reagan administration decided that the program had reached a point where its concealment was no longer worth the operational limitations it created, was itself a managed disclosure. The aircraft was presented at a ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base in a form that showed its existence without fully revealing its capabilities. The details of its radar cross-section and the specific technologies that produced its stealth characteristics remained classified long after the aircraft itself was publicly acknowledged. This is the characteristic pattern of managed disclosure, a partial revelation that satisfies the immediate pressure for acknowledgement without providing the information that would allow genuine technical assessment. Area 51. The Nevada test facility that became the most famous secret base in American history was the site where the U-2 and later the SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft were developed and tested, and where early stealth programs were conducted. Its existence was denied for years by the CIA and Air Force. Its location was visible on unclassified maps. Its flight test activity was observed by residents of surrounding areas who could see unusual aircraft flying at times and in patterns that did not correspond to what they expected. The gap between what the government acknowledged and what local residents could see with their own eyes produced exactly the kind of speculation that official secrecy always creates when it encounters visible evidence. UFO reports, conspiracy theories, stories of recovered alien technology. The government's deliberate policy of not acknowledging its own activities created a space that was filled by imagination, and the imagination that filled it was more dramatic than the reality, which was advanced reconnaissance aircraft and stealth technology rather than extraterrestrial visitors. The irony of Area 51 is that its most famous secret was the mundane one. The United States was conducting test flights of classified aircraft that it did not want adversaries to know about. The reason for the secrecy was entirely practical and in the Cold War context entirely understandable. But the mechanism of secrecy, the flat denial of visible activities, created a credibility problem that made everything else the government said about the facility suspect. When you tell people that what they can see does not exist and then eventually acknowledge that it did exist, the lesson they learn is not that you were right to maintain secrecy for legitimate national security reasons. The lesson they learn is that you will deny what is visibly true when it serves your purposes, and that subsequent denials are not reliable. The post-Cold War status of many of these facilities reflects the institutional resilience of systems built under conditions of perceived existential threat. Cheyenne Mountain was officially placed in a reduced operational status in 2006, with the implication that its mission was being consolidated elsewhere, but was subsequently restored to active operational use when concerns about electromagnetic pulse threats and the vulnerability of less hardened facilities resurfaced. Raven Rock remains operational. The submarine deterrent patrols of both the United States and United Kingdom have continued without interruption. The Russian strategic nuclear force has been maintained and modernized. The Dead Hand system appears to remain operational, based on statements from Russian officials who have referenced it in various contexts over the years since its initial disclosure. The continuity of government infrastructure in the United States has been significantly expanded since the September 2001 attacks, using the legal authorities and institutional frameworks that were developed during the Cold War and applying them to a different threat environment. The facilities built to preserve government function against nuclear attack were adapted and supplemented with new facilities and new procedures designed to address the possibility of large-scale terrorism. The legal authorities governing these arrangements were codified and in some cases expanded. The classified annexes to continuity of government plans were updated and maintained. The shadow government structure that had been built to survive nuclear war was maintained and adapted to ensure continuity against any severe disruption. This is the pattern that the Cold War's hidden facilities established. Systems built under one set of threat assumptions are maintained and adapted as the threat environment changes, because the institutional investment in them creates momentum that is difficult to reverse, and because the argument for maintaining them, that the threat might return or that a new threat requires similar capabilities, is always available and is always difficult to definitively refute. A facility built to survive nuclear war does not become useless when the immediate nuclear threat reduces. It becomes a hedge, a capability maintained against the possibility that the threat environment could change. The cost of maintaining it is real, but bounded. The cost of not maintaining it, if the threat environment changes in the wrong direction, is potentially unbounded. Institutional logic consistently favors the hedge. The sensor networks built during the Cold War have similarly persisted and evolved. The SOSUS hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor remain operational, tracking submarine movements as they have since the 1950s. Their data feeds into naval intelligence systems that have been updated and expanded. The satellites that replaced the U-2 overflights have been supplemented by systems of greater capability. The signals intelligence collection infrastructure, the facilities at Menwith Hill and Pine Gap, and the dozens of other sites across the globe continues to collect and process communications at scales that dwarf what was possible during the Cold War, using technical capabilities that the Cold War programs pioneered. The weapons themselves represent the most direct continuity. The approximately 5,000 warheads in the American arsenal and the approximately 6,000 in the Russian arsenal, figures that represent significant reductions from Cold War peaks, but that remain sufficient to destroy civilized life many times over, are maintained in a state of operational readiness governed by the same doctrinal framework, mutual assured destruction that was developed in the 1950s and 1960s. The submarines on patrol today carry weapons to assigned target sets. The missile silos in the planes states remain on alert status that would allow their missiles to launch within minutes of a decision to do so. The bombers maintain a reduced alert posture compared to the Cold War peak, but the capability to generate sorties on relatively short notice remains. The command and control systems that would be used to direct these weapons in a conflict have been updated with technology that was not available during the Cold War, but their fundamental architecture, the geographic distribution, the redundancy, the emphasis on surviving a first strike reflects the design decisions made when these systems were built. The bunkers that house backup command nodes, the airborne command posts that are maintained in ready status, the submarine communication systems that allow orders to reach submarines at depth, all of these elements of the command and control architecture are direct descendants of what was built in the 1960s and 1970s to address the specific problem of maintaining command authority after a nuclear exchange had begun. The arms-controlled treaties that were supposed to reduce these risks have themselves become a matter of uncertainty. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire category of ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles from European deployment, and which was one of the significant achievements of the late Cold War diplomatic effort, was terminated in 2019, with both the United States and Russia accusing the other of violations. The New START treaty that limited strategic warhead numbers and imposed inspection and verification requirements entered a period of suspended implementation in 2023, when Russia announced it was suspending its participation, citing the overall state of relations and the conflict in Ukraine. The verification mechanisms that had been built into arms control agreements, the inspection regimes, and data exchanges and monitoring provisions are in partial suspension at a moment when the strategic relationship between Russia and the United States is at its worst point since the Cold War. The facilities built during the Cold War are therefore not historical artifacts. They are operational infrastructure for a strategic relationship that has not resolved the fundamental tensions that produced them. The underground bunkers and mountain complexes and hardened command posts were built to manage a conflict that was expected to be permanent, and that the people who built these things did not expect to see resolved in their lifetimes. When the Cold War ended, or appeared to end, the facilities did not disappear. The weapons did not disappear. The doctrine that justified the weapons and the facilities did not fundamentally change. What changed was the political context, the nominal state of relations between the major nuclear powers, and the public attention directed at the continued existence of these systems. That public attention has, for most of the period since 1991, been directed elsewhere. The facilities and the systems and the doctrines have persisted in a state of reduced visibility, maintained by institutional structures that continue to operate according to Cold War logic, even when the Cold War framing is no longer publicly applied to them. The people who work in these facilities today are doing substantially the same work that their predecessors did during the Cold War. They are maintaining readiness against the possibility of conflict. They are updating targeting assignments and training on procedures and monitoring sensor networks and sitting in underground rooms watching displays that show the current state of a world that is, at any given moment, not at war, but not unambiguously safe from war. The ending of the Cold War did not shut off the systems that were built to manage it. It reduced their operational tempo in certain respects and changed the political discourse around them in others. But the fundamental architecture, the buried cables and reinforced bunkers and automated warning systems and submarine-launched ballistic missiles and the protocols for their use remains in place. The facilities described in the preceding account are real. Some of them are still operational. Some of them have been repurposed. Some of them are nominally decommissioned, but structurally intact. And the systems they were built to house continue to function, maintained by people following procedures written during a conflict that officially ended more than 30 years ago, in a world that has not yet found a way to make those procedures unnecessary.